The 2019-21 QPR templates have been modified a little bit to make just the navigation and ease of use improve, but because of all of the formulas and calculations in the background, we couldn't do everything that we wanted to. So not all the tabs may look the same, but they should be working appropriately for you to submit information to us and let us compare your actuals to what you had projected in your application. The first tab, the dashboard, is going to be filled in by DOT and then locked down. This isn't something that you should have to enter anything into. It includes the funding and also the projected hours, miles, and trips and your community liaison. You notice I started with dashboard. There actually is another tab here, but this navigation tab is kind of useless, and I would suggest you just hide that if your community liaison hasn't already hidden it from you before they send it out. So the summary tab is where you'll be able to go back and look at how your actuals are comparing to what you had projected in your application. The projected revenue, hours, miles, and trips will auto-populate based on what you put for the biennium divided by 8. We do realize that seasonally these amounts are going to change, they're going to fluctuate, but as we look at the whole year or the whole biennium, things should pretty much even out. If it turns out that your performance is really far below what you had anticipated, contact your community liaison so you can talk about whether you need to adjust expectations. This sheet is also going to give you valuable information such as the cost per mile. The in-kind tab only applies to projects that are using in-kind. So this used to be the volunteer tab, and sometimes people used volunteers even though they weren't using the value of those volunteers for in-kind. Well, this tab is only going to be used if you are using in-kind, and that means that you have submitted an in-kind plan that's been approved by DOT. The tab may be hidden by your community liaison before you get it if you don't have any in-kind. It's got a space for volunteer drivers, other volunteer services, and then donated goods. So you'll keep adding to this form every quarter of what the fair market value of that donated goods or services are. Program income is related to the receipt of federal funds only. And we're not talking about the income that you get from fairs or the donations in lieu of fairs, but if you are doing some kind of business like advertising on the side of your bus that generates revenue, that's what you would put here. If you do not have any federal funds, your community liaison may have hidden this tab. You will list the type of activity that revenue was earned on, the amount earned, and the date or date range. We already know the agreement number, but we still would like to see what the project letter for that agreement is if you've got multiple projects. And then any additional notes regarding that income. We have to report that to the FTA. The complaints tab, we unfortunately did not lose that big ugly black bar at the top. This is really just a civil rights complaint tab. And if you use the drop down under type of complaint, you will see the 3 different types. So you'll choose one of those, and then which project, the date that you received, that your organization received the complaint, a description of the complaint, the current status of the complaint, and there are a variety of stock answers there that you can choose from the drop down, and then include any actions taken or if there was resolution. This is a cumulative list. So each quarter you will update what the status and the actions taken are, because you may receive a complaint in one quarter, investigate it in a second quarter, and not resolve it until a third quarter. So you'll continue to update the status of a complaint, and while you're also adding any new complaints that you receive in the newer quarters. The DBE tab has been revised. The form that we're using can be used for both construction and operations. So that's why it's got this section for prime contractor and subcontractors. Most of you are going to be using this for operating and mobility management projects, and you will just be using the fields down below the vendor section, and that would be something like, Joe's janitorial service. And then if you've got a contract with them to spend $12,000 over a year, you would put the $12,000 and then the amount paid this quarter and the type of work performed. Now, Joe's is assuming it is a official DBE vendor. If you have contracts with janitorial service or printing or web development and there is not a DBE involved, then you don't need to list anything in this section. We do want you to talk about how the current quarter's progress compares to the the goal that you listed in your application for how much of your operating expenses you expected to be able to be contracted to a DBE. And then finally, and this is the most important part, we really want you to fill out number 2, and if you don't, we will send it back to you and ask you to complete your QPR before you can get your invoice paid. This is describing what you did this quarter to try and find a DBE contractor. We realize that there's a lot of times that because of your location or what your contracting needs are will preclude you finding a DBE vendor, but we just want to know that you have made that effort. Previously, the narrative reports were separate documents, and now they are part of the same workbook. The mobility management narrative, both of the narrative forms, you put the project number at the top, and then you'll find that the community liaison has filled in your description, or they'll ask you to fill it in the first quarter. And this part has changed. For mobility management, we asked you to give us targets that were quantitative data that we could track over the year. And so we've got measures and targets from your application. And again, either the community liaison will fill those out, or we will ask you to do it in the first quarter. And then those fields will just stay the same throughout the biennium, but your actuals this quarter will change each biennium. So you'll overwrite that because you are going to be using the same form each quarter and just adding the information for the new quarter. And then in operating, again, put your project letter in. We didn't automatically put like project A because we could have an operating contract that projects A and C are mobility management and B and D are operating. So we ask that you put your own project number in, fill out the form. It gets to the bottom. This should be familiar to you. Uh-oh, missing something there. When you get to the bottom, there should be an additional place to put another project. So if you have got additional projects and you don't see a space to put that, communicate with your community liaison and we can work together to amend your form. Now finally, these quarter tabs, they should look almost exactly like they did before. You can find your funding sources and the breakout in your invoice form. When you fill out your invoice form, there's a formula built in that breaks it out into the different funding sources. So be sure you keep it under the correct mode, whether it's fixed route, route deviated, demand response. And I want you to ignore this other field. In every quarter, ignore it. It'll just screw up our numbers when we look at the summary tab if you put anything in those. And then choose your type of local funds. If you don't see the type you're using there, then you can just type in anything and enter the amount. The match funds will auto-calculate and the column total will auto-calculate, and the column total means that would be your total project because it's the grant funds plus your local funds. And then include the hours, miles, and trips, and describe your method for determining ridership numbers. Once you fill this out in the first quarter, it may not change for the entire biennium. If it does, you need to go in and change this, but that is reasonable that you would just leave it the same because usually you use the same method to determine or estimate your ridership numbers throughout the biennial period. If you have got any additional questions about how to fill out your QPR, your community liaison will be happy to help.